May 13, 1943. 300 miles southeast of Sicily, beneath a Mediterranean sky heavy with storm clouds and the weight of history, the USS Wolsey cut through black waters that had witnessed 3 years of war, her hull trembling with the rhythm of twin General Electric turbines generating 28,000 horsepower. On the destroyer's bridge, the night watch maintained their vigil in the peculiar silence that comes before decisive moments, a silence broken only by the steady ping of sonar pulses reaching into the depths, searching for prey that had grown increasingly desperate as the walls of North Africa collapsed around them. Seaman First Class Thomas Keller pressed the rubber headphones tighter against his ears, his fingers dancing across the dials of the QGB sonar console with the practiced precision of a concert pianist. The equipment hummed with electrical warmth in the cramped sonar compartment, its cathode ray screens casting green shadows across his concentration-lined face. For 18 hours, he had been listening to the heartbeat of the sea, the distant thunder of merchant convoys, the metallic groaning of his own ship's hull under stress, and beneath it all, something else, something that moved with purpose through waters that had become a trap. The air in the Mediterranean carried more than salt that night. It carried the smell of diesel fuel and cordite, the metallic tang of fear, and the weight of an empire's final breath. 300 feet below the Wolsey's keel, the German submarine U-371 maintained a depth that should have made her invisible, her Type 7C hull painted in the mottled grey that had once guaranteed safe passage through these waters. But tonight was different. Tonight, the Mediterranean no longer belonged to the Reich. Commander Helmut Rosenbaum adjusted his Zeiss periscope one final time, the lens fogged with condensation from the nervous breathing of 44 men who understood they were carrying more than torpedoes in their hull. Sealed in waterproof containers within the submarine's forward compartment lay the complete operational plans for the defense of southern Italy, detailed assessments of German defensive capabilities, and most critically, the personal papers and strategic intelligence gathered by the remnants of the Africa Corps' officer corps during their final weeks in Tunisia. This submarine was not merely fleeing, she was attempting to preserve the institutional memory of 3 years of desert warfare, carrying the lessons learned by Rommel's army back to the German High Command. The war in North Africa had ended not with the dramatic surrender of armies in the field, but with the quiet desperation of men attempting to slip away in darkness, carrying their secrets with them across waters that grew more dangerous with each passing hour. In the ports of Bizerte and Tunis, German officers had laughed at Allied predictions of a total blockade. The Americans, they had scoffed over glasses of wine requisitioned from French cellars. They understand the Atlantic, perhaps, but the Mediterranean, this sea has been ours since the summer of 1940. Their confidence rested on 3 years of successful submarine operations that had turned the Mediterranean into a German lake. Italian and German submarines had sunk over 400 Allied vessels in these waters, establishing patrol routes and safe passage corridors that seemed as permanent as shipping lanes. The officer corps of the Africa Corps had been promised safe evacuation by submarine, a promise that seemed reasonable given the Kriegsmarine's track record of extracting high-value personnel from impossible situations. They had evacuated commanders from Crete, from Norway, from a dozen surrounded garrisons. The Mediterranean evacuation would be routine. But by May 1943, routine had become fatal. Operation Retribution, conceived in the strategic planning rooms of the Pentagon and refined in the Admiralty buildings of London, represented more than a naval blockade. It represented the application of industrial-scale ASW technology to a contained body of water. General Dwight Eisenhower had issued the order with characteristic precision: no German soldier, no German sailor, and no German plan shall leave North Africa alive. The mathematics of the operation were staggering in their completeness. 218 Allied warships formed an invisible wall stretching from Gibraltar to Alexandria, their sonar screens overlapping to create a detection net with no gaps larger than 2 nautical miles. Above them, 547 aircraft maintained constant patrol, their crews trained specifically in the recognition patterns of periscope wakes and the subtle thermal signatures left by submerged diesel engines. Every Allied vessel in the Mediterranean carried the latest advances in anti-submarine warfare technology, equipment that had been tested in the brutal crucible of the Atlantic convoy battles and refined through 3 years of industrial innovation. The technological heart of this blockade lay in devices like the QGB sonar system installed aboard the USS Wolsey, manufactured by the Western Electric Company in their Chicago facilities. Each unit represented thousands of hours of engineering refinement focused on a single objective: the detection and destruction of submerged targets. The QGB could identify submarine signatures at ranges exceeding 4,000 yards. Its acoustic arrays sensitive enough to distinguish between the sound signatures of different classes of submarine, even to the point of identifying specific vessels by the unique acoustic patterns of their machinery. Each ping from the Woolsey's sonar transmitted 1,800 watts of acoustic energy in a focused beam that could penetrate thermoclines and detect metallic objects against the natural background noise of the sea. The returning echoes were processed through analog computers that had been designed specifically for real-time target tracking, their mechanical calculating engines spinning with the precision of Swiss clockwork to provide firing solutions accurate to within 50 yards at maximum range. This was precision warfare reduced to mathematics, the transformation of hunting instinct into engineering calculation. Commander James Morrison stood in the Woolsey's Combat Information Center, studying the tactical plot with the concentrated attention of a chess master examining a complex endgame. At 34, he had already commanded 2 destroyers in the Pacific Theater, earning a reputation for the methodical destruction of Japanese submarines around Guadalcanal. His appointment to Operation Retribution reflected the Navy's confidence in his ability to adapt Pacific warfare techniques to Mediterranean conditions, a confidence that would be tested in the coming hours. The destroyer's crew had been at general quarters for 6 hours, their nerves taut with the particular tension that comes from hunting an enemy who can strike without warning from any direction. In the sonar compartment, Thomas Keller maintained his electronic vigil with the focused intensity of a man who understood that 44 German lives, and potentially thousands of Allied lives, hung on his ability to distinguish between the echo of a whale and the signature of a submarine's hull. The responsibility weighed on him like a physical presence, made heavier by the knowledge that similar scenes were playing out across 100 similar destroyers scattered throughout the Mediterranean. At 0347 hours, the nature of the hunt changed. Keller's sonar detected what appeared to be a solid contact, bearing 315 degrees, range 3,200 yards, moving at approximately 8 knots, on a course that would take it directly through the Allied patrol line. The signature was strong, consistent, and unmistakably metallic, but it was also impossibly deep. The contact appeared to be maintaining a depth of 240 feet, well below the normal operating depth for any known German submarine, and deeper than most Allied sonar operators believed possible for sustained underwater travel. Contact, bearing 315, range 3200, Keller reported, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline that had begun coursing through his veins. Metallic signature, speed 8 knots, course 090. Morrison moved to the sonar console, studying the green traces on the cathode ray tube with the analytical mind that had made him one of the Navy's most effective submarine hunters. The contact was there, solid, consistent, and moving with the deliberate precision of a submarine attempting to slip through the blockade undetected. But the depth reading troubled him. German submarines simply did not operate at such depths. The crush depth for a Type 7C U-boat was generally believed to be around 700 feet, but sustained operations below 200 feet put enormous stress on hull plates and seals. "Secure from general quarters," Morrison ordered, his decision reflecting the caution that had kept him alive through 2 years of submarine warfare. "Resume normal patrol. That contact is too deep to be a submarine." But Thomas Keller did not remove his headphones. Something in the acoustic signature of the contact had caught his attention, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed almost organic, yet unmistakably artificial. He had listened to the sounds of submarines for 18 months, had learned to identify the specific acoustic signatures of diesel and electric motors, and the various mechanical systems that kept submarines operational. This contact sounded like a submarine, but a submarine operating under extreme stress. The U-371 had indeed descended to a crushing depth, her hull groaning under pressure that pushed the submarine to the very limits of her engineering tolerances. Commander Rosenbaum had made the desperate decision to dive deeper than any German submarine had ever attempted in operational conditions, betting his crew's lives on the assumption that Allied sonar operators would dismiss any contact at such depth as impossible. It was a calculated gamble based on intelligence reports that suggested Allied anti-submarine warfare doctrine did not account for deep diving operations. The gamble might have worked, but it had not accounted for the persistence of one American sonar operator who trusted his equipment more than conventional wisdom. Keller continued to track the contact, noting subtle changes in its acoustic signature that suggested a submarine fighting to maintain depth control while pushing through crushing pressure. The sound was wrong for a whale, wrong for a school of fish, wrong for geological formations. It was the sound of German engineering pushed beyond its design limits. At 04:12 hours, Keller made a decision that would rewrite the tactical manual for Mediterranean anti-submarine warfare. He keyed his intercom and reported directly to the bridge, bypassing the normal chain of command. Bridge, sonar. I have a submarine contact, bearing 313, range 2800. Contact is maintaining impossible depth, but signature is consistent with Type 7 U-boat running silent and deep. Morrison returned to the sonar compartment, this time bringing with him Chief Petty Officer Martinez, the Woolsey's senior sonar technician, and a veteran of 18 months of Atlantic convoy duty. Martinez listened to the contact for 3 minutes, his experienced ear analyzing every harmonic and overtone in the acoustic signature. His conclusion was unequivocal. That's a submarine, sir. German diesel-electric, probably Type 7. She's running deeper than we've ever seen, but she's there. The order to return to general quarters sent the Woolsey's crew racing to battle stations with the coordinated efficiency of a crew that had drilled this evolution hundreds of times. In the Combat Information Center, plotting boards came alive with the geometric precision of a submarine attack, courses and speeds calculated with slide rule accuracy. The destroyer's 5-inch guns swung toward the target bearing, their crews loading high explosive shells that would never be fired. This was a job for depth charges. The QGB sonar had evolved far beyond the primitive listening devices used in the First World War. Its transducer arrays could maintain contact with submerged targets while the attacking ship maneuvered at high speed, providing continuous tracking data that was automatically fed into mechanical fire control computers. These computers calculated the complex three-dimensional problem of intercepting a moving target at unknown depth, accounting for the time of flight of depth charges, the effect of ocean currents, and the probable evasive maneuvers of the target. At 04:45 hours, the USS Woolsey began her attack run. The destroyer accelerated to flank speed, her twin screws churning the Mediterranean into white foam as she closed the range to her target. In the sonar compartment, Thomas Keller maintained contact despite the acoustic interference generated by his own ship's machinery, calling out continuous updates on the submarine's position and movement. The U-371 had detected the approaching destroyer and was attempting evasive maneuvers, but her deep-diving gambit had become a trap. The extreme depth made rapid course changes impossible without risking catastrophic hull failure. The first pattern of depth charges left the Woolsey's stern at precisely 0451 hours. 5 Mark 7 charges, set to detonate at depths of 100, 150, 200, 250, and 300 feet. Each charge contained 700 pounds of TNT, enough explosive power to crush a submarine's hull at close range or cause fatal damage to critical systems at longer distance. The charges sank through the Mediterranean's surprisingly clear water, like metallic raindrops, their hydrostatic pistols counting down the seconds until detonation. The explosions began at 4-second intervals, each detonation sending a hemisphere of crushing pressure expanding through the water at the speed of sound. The acoustic shock waves reflected off the ocean floor and surface, creating a complex pattern of compression waves that could rupture human eardrums, collapse lung tissue, and buckle steel plating. Inside the U-371, the crew felt each explosion as a physical blow, the submarine's hull ringing like a church bell as shockwaves passed through her structure. Commander Rosenbaum ordered emergency surface, abandoning the deep-diving strategy that had brought his submarine to within 200 yards of escape. The U-371's ballast tanks expelled their water in a desperate rush toward the surface, the submarine rising through crushing pressure with her hull plates groaning and rivets weeping seawater. But the damage had been done. The extreme depth had stressed hull seals beyond their design limits, and the shockwaves from the depth charges had completed the work of destruction. The submarine broke surface at 05:17 hours, her conning tower emerging into the grey dawn light like a wounded whale seeking air. Seawater poured from damaged hull plates, and her diesel engines coughed black smoke into the Mediterranean sky. From the Woolsey's bridge, Commander Morrison could see German sailors streaming onto the submarine's deck, their movements urgent and desperate. The U-371 was dying, her hull cracked, and her machinery failing, but she was not yet dead. What followed was not the dramatic gun battle that Hollywood would later imagine, but the methodical process of naval surrender. The U-371 signaled surrender using the International Semaphore Code, her signal lamp blinking the letters that ended her war. I surrender. The Woolsey responded with equal formality, ordering the German submarine to maintain position and prepare to receive a boarding party. The boarding of the U-371 revealed the full scope of what the Allied blockade had accomplished. In addition to her normal complement of officers and crew, the submarine carried 12 members of the Africa Corps staff, including 2 colonels and a brigadier general who had commanded armoured units during the final battles around Tunis. More importantly, she carried 15 waterproof containers holding the complete German assessment of Allied capabilities in North Africa, detailed plans for the defence of southern Italy, and personal communications from Field Marshal Rommel to the German High Command. Among the documents recovered from the U-371 was a letter from Rommel to Hitler, dated May 7, 1943, in which the Desert Fox provided a brutally honest assessment of German prospects in the Mediterranean theatre. The war in Africa is lost beyond any possibility of recovery. The Allied superiority in industrial production, combined with their mastery of anti-submarine warfare techniques, has made the Mediterranean impassable for German forces. Any attempt to reinforce or evacuate significant numbers of troops will result only in their unnecessary destruction. The intelligence value of these documents was immeasurable, but their symbolic importance was even greater. The capture of the U-371 represented the closing of the last escape route from Hitler's African Empire, the final severing of the supply lines that had sustained German forces in North Africa for 33 months. Every subsequent attempt at submarine evacuation would end in similar capture or destruction, as the mathematical precision of Operation Retribution made escape statistically impossible. The technology that made this level of control possible represented the culmination of 3 years of intensive research and development in anti-submarine war. The QGB sonar systems installed on Allied destroyers incorporated advances in acoustic engineering, electronic miniaturization, and mechanical computation that had been developed specifically for submarine detection. Each system cost the equivalent of $40,000 in 1943 currency, representing an investment in technology that exceeded the total pre-war budget of many smaller nations. But technology alone had not won this victory. The success of Operation Retribution depended on the training and dedication of thousands of Allied personnel who had mastered the complex art of submarine hunting. Men like Thomas Keller, whose willingness to trust his equipment and his instincts despite contrary doctrine, represented the human element that transformed technological capability into tactical victory. The U-371 had been detected not because her commander made an error, but because an American sonar operator had been trained to recognize patterns that German tactical doctrine assumed were undetectable. The psychological impact of the U-371's capture resonated throughout the German submarine force. Within weeks of her surrender, intercepts of German naval communications revealed a dramatic change in U-boat tactics in the Mediterranean. Submarine commanders, who had previously operated with confident aggression, began avoiding Allied patrol areas, limiting their operations to shallow coastal waters, where their acoustic signatures would be masked by natural background noise. The era of German submarine dominance in the Mediterranean had ended not with a single decisive battle, but with the gradual realization that the sea had become a killing ground for any German vessel that dared to submerge. The industrial infrastructure that supported Operation Retribution represented one of the largest coordinated manufacturing efforts in human history. The Western Electric Company alone had produced over 200 QGB sonar systems for the Mediterranean fleet, each unit requiring precision components manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The acoustic transducers were built using crystals grown in laboratory conditions that had not existed before 1940, while the electronic amplification circuits incorporated vacuum tubes designed specifically for underwater acoustic applications. The depth charges that sank the U-371 were manufactured at munitions plants across the United States. Their explosive charges mixed and loaded by workers who understood they were producing weapons that would determine the outcome of battle fought thousands of miles from American shores. Each Mark 7 depth charge represented 47 separate manufacturing operations, from the machining of the steel casing to the final calibration of the hydrostatic detonator. The logistical challenge of delivering these weapons to Mediterranean battlefields required a supply chain that stretched across 3 continents and involved coordination between dozens of Allied agencies. The men who operated this technology came from every corner of the Allied world. Thomas Keller had been trained at the Navy's Sound School in Key West, Florida, where he had spent 6 months learning to identify submarine signatures using equipment that simulated every known German U-boat class. His training had included recognition of acoustic signatures at extreme depths, based on theoretical calculations that German submarines might attempt deep-diving operations to evade detection. This theoretical knowledge had proved decisive in the detection of the U-371. Commander Morrison had learned anti-submarine warfare in the crucible of the Atlantic convoy battle, where German U-boats had sunk over 300 Allied merchant vessels before the tide of battle turned in favor of the escort. His experience hunting submarines in the open Atlantic had taught him patience and persistence, qualities that had enabled him to trust his sonar operator's judgment, despite the apparent impossibility of the detection. The coordination between officer and enlisted man, between theoretical knowledge and practical experience, had created the conditions for tactical victory. The capture of the U-371 marked the beginning of the end for German submarine operations in the Mediterranean, but it also represented something larger, the moment when industrial capacity and technological innovation combined to make traditional military strategies obsolete. The German submarine force had been built around the concept of stealth and surprise, the ability to strike without warning and disappear into the vastness of the ocean. Operation Retribution had demonstrated that no ocean was vast enough to hide from sufficiently advanced detection technology, and that industrial production could create surveillance networks of unprecedented density and effectiveness. In the months that followed, the mathematical precision of the Allied blockade became increasingly apparent. Of 47 German submarines that attempted to evacuate personnel from North Africa, only 3 succeeded in reaching European ports. The remainder were sunk, captured, or forced to seek internment in neutral ports, their crews becoming prisoners of war rather than returning to fight in other theaters. The Mediterranean had been transformed from a German lake into an Allied highway, a transformation that had required the coordination of military strategy, industrial production, and technological innovation on a scale never before attempted in human history. The personal cost of this transformation was measured not only in the lives of German submariners, but in the exhaustion and stress experienced by Allied personnel who maintained the blockade. Thomas Keller would serve for 18 more months aboard the USS Wolsey, participating in the invasions of Sicily and Italy, listening to his sonar for the distinctive signatures of German submarines that became increasingly rare as the war progressed. His detection of the U-371 earned him a Navy Commendation Medal, but more importantly, it established acoustic detection protocols that would be used throughout the remainder of the war. The strategic implications of Operation Retribution extended far beyond the Mediterranean theater. The success of the Allied blockade demonstrated that modern industrial nations could achieve levels of tactical control that had been impossible in earlier conflict. The combination of advanced technology, mass production, and coordinated training had created military capabilities that transformed the fundamental nature of naval warfare. German submarine commanders, who had terrorized Allied shipping for 3 years, found themselves hunted by an enemy whose technological sophistication exceeded anything they had encountered. The U-371's war diary, recovered during the submarine's boarding, provided a remarkable window into the German experience of this transformation. Commander Rosenbaum's final entries revealed a professional naval officer coming to terms with the reality that his tactics, his training, and his equipment had been rendered obsolete by an enemy whose industrial capacity seemed limitless. "The Americans have turned the entire Mediterranean into a machine for killing submarines," he wrote. "Every mile of water is watched. Every sound is analyzed. Every shadow is investigated. We are not fighting sailors. We are fighting a system." This system represented the full mobilization of American industrial capacity for military purposes, a mobilization that had begun with the Lend-Lease program and reached full development by 1943. The sonar systems that detected German submarines were manufactured in facilities that had produced radio equipment for the war, using precision manufacturing techniques that had been developed for civilian electronics. The depth charges that destroyed those submarines were produced using industrial processes scaled up from peacetime munitions manufacturing, while the ships that carried both systems were built in shipyards that had expanded their capacity by factors of 10 or more since 1940. The human dimension of this industrial transformation was perhaps most clearly visible in the training programs that had created operators like Thomas Keller. The Navy's Sound School had trained over 12,000 sonar operators between 1940 and 1945, each receiving 6 months of intensive instruction in acoustic theory, equipment operation, and target recognition. This represented an educational effort that exceeded the normal peacetime enrollment of most American universities, compressed into training programs that were specifically designed to create expertise in a single, highly specialized field. The mathematics of submarine detection had been reduced to teachable principles that could be mastered by young men who had never seen the ocean before enlisting in the Navy. Acoustic theory that had required university-level physics education before the war was taught using simplified models and practical exercises that allowed high school graduates to achieve professional competence in underwater sound analysis. This democratization of technical knowledge represented one of the war's most significant achievements, the transformation of advanced scientific knowledge into practical skills that could be mass-produced through industrial-scale training programs. The final confrontation between the USS Woolsey and the U-371 had lasted less than 4 hours, but it had encompassed years of technological development, months of training, and the coordination of military and industrial efforts involving hundreds of thousands of people. The detection of a single German submarine at impossible depth had required the successful integration of scientific research, industrial production, military training, and individual courage. Thomas Keller's decision to trust his equipment, despite conventional wisdom, had been enabled by technologies and training programs that represented the full mobilization of American society for total war. The surrender of the U-371 was witnessed by the crews of 2 British destroyers that had been vectored to assist the Woolsey in attack. HMS Meteor and HMS Musketeer had maintained sonar contact with the German submarine throughout the engagement, providing redundant tracking data that ensured the target could not escape even if the Woolsey's systems failed. This level of coordination between Allied vessels represented the standardization of anti-submarine tactics that had been developed through 3 years of convoy warfare in the Atlantic. The British ships carried sonar systems that were technically different from the American QGB, but operationally compatible through the adoption of common communication protocols and tactical procedures. British operators had been trained using the same acoustic recognition techniques used by their American counterparts, creating interoperability that allowed multinational task forces to hunt submarines with unprecedented effectiveness. The U-371 had been tracked not by a single ship, but by a coordinated network of Allied vessels whose acoustic sensors overlapped to create a detection net from which escape was mathematically impossible. The interrogation of the U-371's crew revealed the extent to which German naval intelligence had failed to understand the scope of Allied technological advancement. German estimates of Allied sonar capabilities had been based on equipment captured during the early years of the war, when acoustic detection systems were primitive and unreliable. The rapid pace of technological development in Allied shipyards and electronics laboratories had outstripped German intelligence gathering, creating a knowledge gap that had proved fatal to submarine operations. Commander Rosenbaum had been operating under tactical assumptions that were 18 months out of date, using evasion techniques that had been effective against the primitive sonar systems of 1941, but were easily defeated by the sophisticated equipment of 1943. His decision to dive to extreme depth had been based on intelligence reports suggesting that Allied operators would dismiss deep contacts as impossible, intelligence that had failed to account for the improved training and equipment that made deep diving detection routine. The technological revolution that had made Operation Retribution possible was visible not only in the sophisticated equipment carried by Allied warships, but in the industrial infrastructure that supported sustained naval operations in the Mediterranean. Every Allied destroyer required a continuous supply of fuel oil, lubricant, ammunition, spare parts, and provisions that had to be transported across thousands of miles of ocean and delivered to forward bases with clockwork precision. The logistics of maintaining 218 warships in continuous operation required the coordination of merchant vessels, port facilities, repair shops, and supply depots on a scale that had never been attempted before. The QGB sonar system that detected German submarines required regular maintenance by technicians who had been trained in specialized schools established specifically for that purpose. The depth charges that destroyed those submarines had to be transported, stored, and loaded using handling equipment that had been designed for maximum efficiency and safety. This logistical achievement represented the application of industrial management techniques to military operations, transforming naval warfare from a craft-based activity dependent on individual skill and experience into a systematized process that could be scaled to any required level of intensity. The Mediterranean fleet had become a machine for the destruction of enemy submarines. a machine that could operate continuously because it was supported by an industrial base capable of producing unlimited quantities of fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. The personal experiences of the men who operated this machine revealed the human cost of technological warfare. Thomas Keller would later describe his 18 months as a sonar operator as a period of constant nervous tension, in which the responsibility for detecting enemy submarines created psychological stress that manifested in sleeplessness, anxiety, and hypervigilance that persisted long after the war ended. The technological capability that made submarine detection possible had been purchased with the mental health of thousands of young men who spent months listening to the sounds of the ocean, knowing that their vigilance was all that stood between their shipmates and sudden death. The German submariners who became prisoners of war after the surrender of the U-371 described similar psychological pressures, but experienced from the perspective of the hunted rather than the hunter. Commander Rosenbaum's post-war interviews revealed that German submarine crews had gradually become aware that their traditional tactical advantages had been neutralized by Allied technological advances, creating a sense of helplessness that affected morale and combat effectiveness throughout the German submarine. The strategic impact of this technological transformation extended far beyond the immediate tactical results achieved in the Mediterranean. The success of Operation Retribution provided proof of concept for industrial-scale warfare that would be applied to subsequent operations in the Pacific Theater and the invasion of Europe. The coordination of research, development, production, and training that had made the Mediterranean blockade possible became the template for Allied victory in every subsequent campaign. The detection and capture of the U-371 represented the moment when this system achieved full operational capability, demonstrating that Allied technological superiority had reached the point where German countermeasures were no longer viable. The submarine that had been designed to operate invisibly beneath the surface of the ocean had been tracked, hunted, and captured by an enemy whose acoustic sensors could penetrate the deepest waters and whose industrial capacity could maintain surveillance networks of unlimited size and sophistication. The documents recovered from the U-371 provided Allied intelligence agencies with detailed insights into German defensive planning for southern Italy, enabling the optimization of invasion plans that would be implemented 3 months later during Operation Husky. The personal communications from Africa Corps officers revealed German assessments of Allied combat effectiveness that confirmed the success of military training programs and tactical innovations that had been developed during the North African campaign. More importantly, the capture of senior German officers provided opportunities for interrogation that revealed the extent of German knowledge about Allied capabilities and planning. The psychological impact of these interrogations extended far beyond the intelligence gathered, as German officers realized that their opponents possessed technological and industrial capabilities that made continued resistance strategically hopeless. The U-371's final radio transmission, sent moments before her surrender, was intercepted by Allied radio intelligence stations and decoded using cryptographic techniques that the Germans believed were secure. The message revealed that Commander Rosenbaum understood his submarine's capture represented more than a tactical defeat. It marked the end of German ability to conduct meaningful naval operations in the Mediterranean. "The sea no longer belongs to us," he radioed to his headquarters. "The Americans have made it their own." This transformation of the Mediterranean from contested battleground to Allied highway was visible in the merchant shipping statistics that were compiled throughout 1943. Allied losses to submarine attack dropped to statistically insignificant levels within weeks of Operation Retribution's implementation, while Axis shipping losses increased to the point where German and Italian naval commanders abandoned attempts to maintain Mediterranean supply lines. The industrial capacity that had created this transformation would be redirected toward the support of amphibious operations that would carry the war directly to the European mainland. The technical innovations that had made submarine detection at extreme depths possible would find applications in post-war oceanographic research, mineral exploration, and commercial fishing. The acoustic engineering principles developed for military sonar systems would contribute to advances in underwater communication, marine biology, and deep-sea exploration that continued long after the war ended. The precision manufacturing techniques developed for sonar components would find application in consumer electronics, industrial automation, and aerospace technology. But the immediate impact of these innovations was measured in the lives saved and battles won through application of advanced technology to military. The crew of the USS Woolsey would participate in 4 major amphibious operations over the following 18 months. providing anti-submarine screening for invasion fleets that could operate with confidence because the surrounding waters had been cleared of enemy submarines through the systematic application of industrial-scale warfare. Thomas Keller would return to civilian life in 1945, carrying with him the knowledge that his service as a sonar operator had contributed to a technological revolution that had fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare. His detection of the U-371 had been enabled by equipment and training that represented the full mobilization of American industrial and educational resources, but it had required individual judgment and courage to achieve tactical success. The mathematical precision of Operation Retribution had demonstrated that modern warfare was becoming increasingly dependent on technological superiority rather than traditional military virtues, but the human element remained decisive at critical moments. The detection of German submarines at impossible depths required both sophisticated equipment and operators who were willing to trust their instruments despite contrary expectations. The surrender of the U-371 marked the end of the German submarine threat in the Mediterranean, but it also marked the beginning of a new era in naval warfare in which technological advancement would determine strategic outcomes more definitively than traditional measures of military strength. The industrial capacity that had created the Mediterranean blockade would be applied to subsequent operations with even greater effectiveness, culminating in victory achieved through the systematic application of technology, training, and industrial production. As the morning sun burned away the last traces of Mediterranean mist on May 13, 1943, the crew of the USS Wolseley could see the full scope of what they had accomplished. The German submarine that had attempted to escape with the secrets of the Africa Corps lay dead in the water, her hull cracked and her crew preparing for captivity. Around them, the Mediterranean stretched empty and peaceful, no longer contested but firmly under Allied control. The sonar equipment that had made this victory possible continued its electronic vigil, sending acoustic pulses into waters that had been permanently transformed from German hunting ground to Allied highway. In the months that followed, these same waters would carry the invasion fleets that would assault Sicily and Italy, protected by anti-submarine screens that had achieved mathematical certainty in their ability to detect and destroy enemy submarines. The last echo of German submarine warfare in the Mediterranean had been silenced not by dramatic naval battle, but by the patient application of industrial technology and human determination. Thomas Keller removed his headphones and secured his sonar console, knowing that his watch had ended with the closing of Hitler's last door to Africa. The sea was quiet now, and it would remain Allied until the war's end. History isn't just written, it's remembered through those who still care to listen. What story should we tell next? Subscribe to keep their memory alive. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps me keep making better content for you.